The thunder boomed across the plains as Elizabeth Davis dismounted her mare, the rain pelting her face as she trudged toward the small cabin, nestled against the backdrop of Wyoming's rugged terrain. She hadn't expected to find anyone living so far from town, but the smoke curling from the chimney and the soft glow of lamplight told her someone was home, someone who might offer shelter from the unforgiving storm that had caught her off guard during her journey west. Elizabeth pulled her soaked coat tighter around her slender frame and hesitated at the door. A proper lady from Philadelphia didn't simply knock on a stranger's door in the middle of nowhere, but proper ladies also didn't travel alone across the frontier in 1876. The last 3 years had taught her that survival sometimes meant abandoning the proprieties she'd been raised with. She rapped her knuckles against the weathered wood, the sound barely audible above the storm's fury. When no one answered, she knocked harder, desperation winning out over decorum. "Hello," she called out. "Is anyone there? I need shelter from the storm." After what seemed an eternity, the door creaked open. The man who stood before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the dim light. He said nothing as he assessed her with tired eyes. "I apologize for the intrusion," Elizabeth began, rainwater dripping from the brim of her hat. "My horse and I got caught in the storm." I was hoping. A soft whimper from inside the cabin interrupted her. The man glanced over his shoulder, his expression softening momentarily before hardening again as he turned back to her. "Come in," he said gruffly, stepping aside. "But be quiet." Elizabeth entered, grateful to escape the rain. The cabin was modest but clean, with a fire crackling in the stone hearth. Her eyes were drawn immediately to the corner of the room, where a small cradle sat. The man moved toward it, his boots making surprisingly little noise on the wooden floor. That's when she saw the scene that would forever change her life. She found the cowboy sitting beside his daughter's cradle, his eyes red from holding it together. In the glow of the firelight, she could see the tracks of tears on his weathered face, the way his large hand gently rocked the cradle with a tenderness that belied his rugged appearance. "Is she all right?" Elizabeth asked softly, remaining near the door, dripping onto the floorboards. The man didn't look up. "She's alive, that's what matters." Elizabeth removed her hat and coat, hanging them on a peg by the door. "My name is Elizabeth Davis. I'm traveling to Laramie." "Preston Porter," he replied after a long pause. "This is Lily." Elizabeth moved closer, her medical training from the Philadelphia Women's Medical College overriding her sense of propriety. "Mr. Porter, I don't mean to intrude, but I have some medical knowledge. If your daughter is unwell, perhaps I could help." Preston's head snapped up, his red-rimmed eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You're a doctor." "Not officially," Elizabeth admitted, "but I trained for 2 years before." She trailed off, unwilling to share the painful reason she'd left her studies. "I have experience with childhood illnesses." For a moment, he seemed torn between protecting his child from a stranger and accepting help that might save her. The little girl whimpered again, and his decision was made. "She's burning with fever," he said, moving aside to let Elizabeth approach. "Started yesterday." "Nothing I've done has helped." Elizabeth knelt beside the cradle, her heart aching at the sight of the tiny child no more than 6 months old, her face flushed with fever, wisps of blonde hair damp against her forehead. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward the baby. Preston nodded, watching anxiously as Elizabeth gently lifted Lily from the cradle. The baby's skin was hot to the touch, her breathing labored. "How long has she been like this?" "The fever started yesterday morning, got worse through the night." Elizabeth laid the baby on the small table, unwrapping her swaddling clothes to examine her more thoroughly. "Has she been eating?" "Barely." "Won't take milk?" As Elizabeth examined the child, she became aware of Preston hovering nearby, his concern palpable. She noticed a small rash beginning on Lily's chest and frowned. "Mr. Porter, do you have any willow bark? And perhaps some honey," he nodded, moving to a small shelf of supplies. "I've got both. Will that help?" "It might bring down her fever," Elizabeth said. "I'll need water too, boiled if possible." For the next hour, Elizabeth worked diligently, preparing a mild tea of willow bark, adding a small amount of honey to make it palatable. Getting the baby to take even a few drops was a challenge, but Preston's steady hands helped, supporting his daughter's head while Elizabeth administered the remedy. "She needs to stay cool," Elizabeth explained, wetting a cloth with cool water and placing it on Lily's forehead. "We need to bring the fever down gradually." Preston watched her every move, his eyes revealing both hope and fear. "Where did you learn all this?" "In Philadelphia," she replied, focused on her task. "I wanted to be a doctor. Women doctors aren't common, but there are some training programs now." "What brought you out here then? Doesn't seem like there's much call for lady doctors in these parts." Elizabeth hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger. "Life takes unexpected turns sometimes." Preston seemed to understand her reluctance. "That it does, Miss Davis." "That it certainly does." As the night wore on, they took turns watching over Lily. The storm continued to rage outside, lightning occasionally illuminating the small cabin. During one such flash, Elizabeth caught sight of a framed photograph on a shelf, a beautiful young woman with Lily's blonde hair and Preston's strong jawline. "Your wife?" she asked softly. Preston, who had been stoking the fire, stiffened. "Yes, Sarah." His voice cracked on the name. "Childbed fever took her 3 months ago." Elizabeth's heart constricted. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Porter." "Preston," he corrected, turning to face her. "Seems we're past formalities, considering you're helping save my daughter's life." "Elizabeth, then," she replied with a small smile. Around midnight, Lily's fever began to break. The baby's breathing eased, and she took more of the willow bark tea, mixed with a bit of cow's milk. Preston's relief was evident in the way his shoulders relaxed, the first genuine smile crossing his face. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of his gratitude. Elizabeth shook her head. "I only did what anyone with knowledge would have done." "Not anyone would have stopped," Preston countered. "Most would have ridden on, looking for more comfortable shelter than a widower's cabin." Elizabeth didn't tell him that she had nowhere else to go, that her funds were nearly depleted, and that Laramie was more a hope than a destination. Instead, she smiled and turned her attention back to Lily, who was finally sleeping peacefully. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clean air and a brilliant blue sky. Lily's fever had broken completely, and she was alert and gurgling, her tiny hands reaching for her father's beard as he held her. Elizabeth stood by the door, her coat and hat in hand. "I should continue my journey," she said, though something in her was reluctant to leave. Preston looked up from his daughter, his expression unreadable. "The trails will be muddy from the storm, dangerous for traveling alone." "I've managed so far," Elizabeth replied, though the thought of the muddy paths made her wince. Her mare was sturdy, but the terrain was challenging even in good weather. Preston hesitated, then spoke as if the words were difficult. "I could use help with Lily. Just until I can find a more permanent arrangement. I can't pay much, but you'd have a roof and meals." Elizabeth was taken aback. "You'd trust a stranger with your daughter. You saved her life," he said simply. "And I've got to tend the cattle. Can't do that and watch her every minute." It was a practical arrangement, born of necessity rather than sentiment, yet Elizabeth found herself considering it seriously. Her plans had been vague at best: find work in Laramie, perhaps as a teacher or nurse, save enough to continue west to California. But winter was approaching, and jobs would be scarce. Just until you find someone more suitable, she agreed finally. Or until spring makes travel easier. Preston nodded, his relief evident. I'll clear out the storage room. It's small, but it'll give you privacy. And so Elizabeth Davis found herself staying on at the Porter Ranch, an arrangement that was supposed to be temporary but somehow stretched from days into weeks. The small storage room became her own, with a narrow bed and a chest for her few belongings. Each day brought a new routine caring for Lily while Preston worked the ranch, learning to cook on the temperamental wood stove, gathering eggs from the ornery hens that seemed determined to peck her every time she approached. Preston was gone from dawn until dusk most days, working tirelessly to maintain the small herd of cattle that was his livelihood. He spoke little, but Elizabeth came to understand that his silence wasn't rudeness, but rather the habit of a man who'd spent too much time alone with his grief. One evening in late October, as the first frost painted the grass silver in the moonlight, Preston returned earlier than usual. Elizabeth was singing softly to Lily, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, when he entered. He stood in the doorway, watching them, an unreadable expression on his face. "She likes your voice," he said finally. Elizabeth smiled down at the drowsy baby. "Music soothes her. She's getting stronger every day." Preston moved closer, his normally stoic face softening as he looked at his daughter. "Sarah used to sing to her. I tried, but I don't have the voice for it." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife voluntarily, and Elizabeth felt privileged by his trust. "Will you tell me about her?" she asked gently. About Sarah. For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he sat down heavily in the chair opposite her, his hands clasped between his knees. "She was from Boston originally. Came out here with her brother after their parents died. Met her at a town social in Cheyenne. She could dance like nobody's business." As he spoke, his voice grew warmer, less guarded. He told Elizabeth how Sarah had insisted on painting the cabin door blue for luck, how she'd made curtains from flour sacks and hung wildflowers to dry from the rafters. How she'd laughed when he proposed, not because it was funny but because she was so happy she couldn't contain it. "She wasn't meant for this hard life," he said finally, looking down at his calloused hands. "But she loved it anyway, loved it because we were building something together." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Preston agreed. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "What about you? You never said what brought you out here alone." Elizabeth cradled Lily closer, finding comfort in the baby's warm weight. "I was engaged," she began, the words feeling strange after so long of not speaking them. "To a doctor I met during my training. He encouraged my studies, said we would practice together." She shook her head, remembering her own naivety. "When his family objected to him marrying a working woman, he changed his mind. Said I could be his wife or a doctor, but not both." Preston's expression darkened. "So you left?" "I left," she confirmed. "My father had just passed, leaving debts I couldn't pay. My fiancé offered to settle them if I abandoned my medical ambitions. I couldn't do it. So you came west." "So I came west," Elizabeth echoed. With what little inheritance remained after the creditors took their share, Preston was quiet for a long moment, then stood. "You're braver than most men I know," he said simply, before bidding her good night. The days grew shorter and colder as November settled over the plains. Elizabeth found herself falling into a rhythm with Preston and Lily, a comfortable familiarity that both soothed and unsettled her. She caught herself watching Preston as he worked around the ranch, admiring the strength in his hands, the gentleness with which he held his daughter. More than once, she found him watching her too, his gaze quickly averted when she noticed. The first snow came early, a light dusting that transformed the landscape into a crystalline wonderland. Elizabeth stood on the porch, Lily bundled against her chest, watching as Preston chopped wood, his breath clouding in the cold air. "We need to talk about winter," he said that evening after Lily had been settled in her cradle. "It gets harsh out here. Trails can be impassable for weeks." Elizabeth nodded, understanding what he was saying. If she intended to leave before spring, she needed to do it soon. "I know," she replied softly. "I've been thinking about it." Preston stared into the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light. "You've been good for Lily. Good for—" He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "If you wanted to stay through winter, I'd be grateful." It wasn't quite an invitation to stay permanently, but it was more than the practical arrangement they'd started with. Elizabeth felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'd like that," she said simply. The winter settled in earnest after that, with snowdrifts piling against the cabin walls and the wind howling through the night. Their world contracted to the warmth of the cabin, the daily chores that kept them alive, and the increasingly precious moments spent together in the evenings. Preston began to open up more, telling stories of his life before the ranch, how he'd left his family's farm in Missouri at 17 to work the cattle drives, how he'd saved every penny to buy his own land, how he'd built this cabin with his own hands in anticipation of winning Sarah's heart. Elizabeth shared her own tales of Philadelphia society, of her medical training, of the women she'd met who were determined to forge their own paths in a world that resisted them. Lily thrived under their joint care, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. Her first tooth appeared just before Christmas, causing sleepless nights that they weathered together, taking turns walking the floor with the cranky baby. On Christmas Eve, Preston surprised Elizabeth with a small gift, a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and promising. "For your medical notes," he explained, a hint of shyness in his usually confident demeanor. "I see you writing on scraps of paper sometimes. Thought you might like something proper." Elizabeth was touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," she said, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "But I didn't get you anything." Preston shook his head. "You've given enough by staying, by saving Lily." Then, more quietly, by making this place feel like a home again. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment Elizabeth thought he might say more. Instead, he cleared his throat and turned to stoke the fire. January brought a blizzard that kept them confined for days, the world outside obliterated by swirling white. They played cards to pass the time, read aloud from Preston's small collection of books, and took turns entertaining Lily, who was now attempting to crawl, much to her father's pride. It was during this storm that the line between friendship and something deeper began to blur. Perhaps it was the enforced intimacy of the small cabin, or perhaps it was simply time healing old wounds. But Elizabeth found herself increasingly aware of Preston as more than just Lily's father or her temporary employer. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness in his hands despite their roughness, the depth of his laugh on the rare occasions when something amused him. She found herself making excuses to be near him, to brush against him as they moved around the cabin's small confines. One evening, as Lily slept peacefully and the wind howled outside, Preston spoke of his fears. "I worry that I'm not enough for her," he said, looking toward the cradle, "that she needs a mother, a woman's influence." Elizabeth set down her mending. "You're a wonderful father, Preston." "Lily is lucky to have you," he shook his head. "I don't know how to braid hair or sew dresses. I don't know the things a mother would teach her daughter." "Those things can be learned," Elizabeth assured him. "And love is what matters most. She'll never doubt that you love her." Preston looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You would have made a fine doctor, Elizabeth. You heal more than just bodies." The compliment warmed her, and she felt herself blushing under his gaze. "Perhaps someday I'll finish my training. When Lily is older and doesn't need me anymore." The words hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that she was thinking beyond winter, beyond the temporary arrangement they'd agreed upon. Preston moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "And if she always needs you?" he asked, his voice low. "If I always need you?" Elizabeth's heart quickened. "Preston." "I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know Sarah's barely cold in her grave and you have dreams beyond this ranch. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just acknowledging what I feel, what I hope you might feel too." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I care for Lily as if she were my own," she admitted. "And I care for you in a way I didn't expect to care for anyone again." Preston's hand found hers, large and warm and steadying. "Then we take it slow, day by day." And so they did, through the rest of winter and into the first tentative days of spring. Their courtship was unlike anything Elizabeth had experienced in Philadelphia society. There were no formal calls or chaperoned outings, no exchange of calling cards or carefully worded letters. Instead, there were shared chores and quiet evenings, stolen moments of conversation while Lily napped, and the gradual, inexorable drawing together of two hearts that had known loss but were brave enough to risk love again. The first kiss came on a March evening, as they stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the snow-covered plains in hues of gold and pink. Preston had just returned from checking on a newborn calf, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. "You're beautiful," he said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as her. "I've been wanting to tell you that for months." Elizabeth smiled, the compliment warming her despite the chill air. "Even with flour in my hair and Lily's breakfast on my apron." "Especially then," he said, stepping closer. "When you're caring for my daughter as if she were your own, when you're making this place a home." His hand came up to cup her cheek, rough calluses against soft skin. Elizabeth leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "May I kiss you, Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, unable to find words for the longing that had built in her over the months. When his lips met hers, gentle at first, then with growing confidence, she felt as if something long broken was finally mending. April brought the mud season, when the snow melted and turned the trails to treacherous ribbons of mire. It also brought the letter from the Laramie Medical Society, responding to the inquiry Elizabeth had sent months ago. They would consider her application for a position as a nurse, with the possibility of furthering her medical training if she could arrive by June. Elizabeth stared at the letter, conflicting emotions warring within her. This was what she had dreamed of, a chance to continue her medical education, to use her skills to help others. But now there was Preston and Lily, the family she had come to love, the life she had begun to build here on this remote ranch. Preston found her on the porch that evening, the letter clutched in her hands. "Bad news?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench. Elizabeth handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. "This is what you wanted," he said finally, returning the letter to her. "What you came west for." "Yes," Elizabeth admitted, "it was." "Was?" Preston caught the past tense, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Elizabeth turned to face him fully. "I don't know what I want anymore. Or rather, I want conflicting things. I want to be a doctor to help people, but I also want—" She hesitated. "What do you want, Elizabeth?" Preston asked softly. "This," she whispered. "You and Lily, this home we've made, I want both, and I don't know how to have both." Preston was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Laramie is a day's ride. Not so far that a person couldn't have a practice there and a home here. Elizabeth's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying that dreams don't have to die for love to live. I'm saying that I love you, Elizabeth Davis, and I want you to be happy. If that means finding a way for you to be both a doctor and... He paused, seeming to gather courage. And my wife, then we'll find that way. Your wife. Elizabeth echoed, her heart racing. Preston took her hands in his. I'm not doing this properly. I don't have a ring yet and I should probably be on one knee, but yes, I'm asking you to marry me, to be Lily's mother in truth, not just in practice. To build a life with me that includes your dreams as well as mine. Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes, but they were tears of joy. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. The wedding took place in May. A simple ceremony in the Laramie church with Lily as their only attendant, perched on the hip of a neighboring rancher's wife. Elizabeth wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Preston had gathered that morning. Their vows were straightforward but heartfelt, promises to love and support each other through whatever life brought their way. And life brought many things in the years that followed. Elizabeth indeed pursued her medical training, riding into Laramie 3 days a week while Preston cared for Lily. When she became known as a skilled midwife and healer, people began to come to the ranch for treatment, and eventually, a small clinic was built adjacent to the cabin. Lily grew into a strong, curious girl with her mother's blonde hair and her father's determined spirit. She knew the story of her birth mother, whose picture remained in a place of honor, and also the story of how Elizabeth had come into their lives on a stormy night, finding a cowboy sitting beside his daughter's cradle, his eyes red from holding it together. It was fate, Preston would say, pulling Elizabeth close as they watched Lily play with her younger siblings, a brother born in the harsh winter of '78 and twin sisters who arrived during a spring thunderstorm in '80. It was courage, Elizabeth would counter, remembering the fear and hope that had brought her west, the chance she had taken on a future unknown. But they both knew it was love imperfect and unexpected, born of grief and necessity, nurtured through hardship and joy. Love that had healed them both and created a family stronger than the sum of its broken parts. On the 10th anniversary of that stormy night, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Preston took Elizabeth's hand and brought it to his lips. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she asked, though she knew. "For stopping that night, for saving our daughter, for saving me." Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the life they had built together. "We saved each other," she said softly, "and that's the greatest healing of all." As the stars emerged in the vast Wyoming sky, Elizabeth thought of all the paths not taken, all the choices that had led her here. She had found not just a home but a purpose, not just a family but a calling. The journey had been neither simple nor easy, but sitting here with Preston's strong arm around her shoulders and their children's laughter in the air, she knew it had been the right one. For love, like the Wild West itself, required courage and faith and the willingness to find beauty in the most unexpected places.